The ocean breeze still smells the same in Kennebunkport. Some days. I sit on my porch wrapped in a wool shawl, watching the gulls glide across the sky and listening to the waves whisper against the shore. It's peaceful now, serene, even. But all it takes is one named Frank Delaney, and the salt air turns sour. The sky grows heavy, and I am no longer 75. I'm 8 years old again, frozen in a kitchen doorway, heart pounding in my chest like it's trying to escape. There are moments in life that mark you, not like soft pencil lines you can erase, but like deep carvings in stone. And the day he first crossed that line was the day everything in my world cracked. But let me start at the beginning, before the pain, before the silence, before the betrayal by the man my father called his best friend. I was born in the fall of 1949 in Kennebunkport, a quiet fishing town along Maine's rocky coast. My name is Kathleen King. Most folks just called me Katie growing up. My father, Robert King, was a boat builder, tough hands, gentle soul. My mother, Martha, kept the house with precision and discipline. She was sharp, no nonsense, and never one to indulge emotions. Between the two of them, I had everything a child needed except maybe softness. Our home was modest but tidy, nestled just off the main road, with white shutters and a worn path leading down to the docks where Daddy worked. Every Sunday afternoon, our house filled with the smell of roast beef and the rumble of men's laughter. That was the day Daddy's best friend, Frank Delaney, would come over for dinner. Frank had known my father since they were boys. They served in the Navy together, fixed up boats together, even went hunting up in Aroostook County every fall. To everyone around us, Frank was practically family. He brought stories, gifts, and always knew just how to make my parents laugh. He'd tousle my hair, hand me candies from his coat pocket, and say I was just the spitting image of my mama, only sweeter. As a little girl, I wanted so badly to believe that Frank was safe, that his kindness wasn't a mask. But even in those early days, something about him always made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain it, not then. He'd hold my hand a little too long, pull me into hugs that felt too tight, whisper things that didn't sound quite right. But when I looked to my mother for help, she'd shoo me away with a scolding, accusing me of being rude, so I learned to stay quiet. At school, I was a good student, quiet, obedient, polite, the kind of girl who never caused trouble. At home, I helped with chores, folded laundry, and stayed out of the way when the grown-ups gathered. No one would have guessed that every time I heard Frank's car tires crunch over our gravel driveway, my stomach twisted in dread. There's something cruel in knowing that the very people meant to protect you, your parents, your community, can also be the ones who turn a blind eye. But back then, in the 1950s, children weren't meant to speak out. We were taught to respect our elders, smile when spoken to, and keep our troubles to ourselves. Looking back, it wasn't just the abuse that damaged me, it was the silence that followed. The way my cries were swallowed by walls too used to ignoring them. The way my mother dismissed my fear as foolishness. The way the world carried on, Sunday after Sunday, as if nothing was wrong. I never told a soul. Not then, not for years, because who would believe that Frank Delaney, honorable Navy vet, faithful friend, churchgoer, handyman to half the town, would do something so wicked and worse? Who would believe a little girl who dared to speak against him? But here I am now, 75 years old, and I've learned that the truth doesn't vanish just because no one wants to hear it. It lingers, it haunts, and until you give it a voice, it will keep you prisoner in your own skin. This is not a story I ever thought I'd tell, but it's one that needs to be told not for pity, not for revenge, but because I know there are others out there like me. People who carry these secrets into old age, afraid to speak them aloud. But I believe it's never too late to reclaim your voice. And this is mine. In the early years, before everything twisted and soured. My life in Kennebunkport was a simple rhythm of school bells, seabird calls, and the smell of salt water soaked into every corner of town. I used to ride my bike down Ocean Avenue, the wind pulling at my braids as I passed by candy-colored beach cottages and clusters of fishermen hauling in their nets. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knew your name and your father's name, and your grandfather's too. My father, Robert King, was well known along the docks. He built boats for a living, small schooners and fishing vessels mostly. He was a man of few words, but there was a warmth to him that came through in gestures. He'd hand me pieces of driftwood shaped like animals or show me how to sand a board until it gleamed like glass. Daddy didn't speak love. He built it, offered it in the form of work-worn hands and quiet presence. My mother, Martha, was his opposite. Where Daddy was soft-spoken and calm, Mama was sharp-edged and quick to correct. She kept a tight ship at home. Chores were done before dinner. Beds were made with hospital corners. Emotions were something to be hidden, not explored. Straighten your back. Kathleen, she'd say. No use crying over things that can't be helped. At school, I was what teachers called a good girl. I got gold stars and perfect attendance certificates. But at home, I learned to live quietly, stepping lightly, closing doors gently, reading books to stay out of grown-up conversations. Mama always praised me for being obedient. She didn't know I was just trying to disappear. And then there was Frank Delaney. Frank was practically a fixture in our house by the time I turned 6. He'd show up with a jug of cider or a slab of smoked ham from the butcher, always clapping my father on the back and throwing his booming laugh around like it belonged to the room. "How's my little Katie bug?" he'd grin, pinching my cheek. Everyone loved Frank. He served with Daddy on the USS Nantucket during the war. They came back as brothers in arms, their bond sealed over stories of torpedoes, rations, and nights at sea. Frank never married, never had children of his own. So he made himself at home in ours. At first, I didn't question it. In my child's eyes, he was just another adult in the circle of grown-ups who controlled the world. He'd bring me coloring books and hard candies wrapped in paper that crinkled like fire. Sometimes, he'd sit me on his knee and tell me stories about dolphins swimming beside his ship. I remember those early years in snapshots, his laughter, the scratch of his whiskered jaw, the way his hand would linger too long on my back. There were things I didn't yet have words for, but my body knew. My shoulders would tense when he entered the room. I'd glance at the door, calculating how fast I could run upstairs if he came too close. I began to dread Sundays. I remember one time when I was 7, I tried to tell my mother that I didn't like Frank. I didn't say why. I didn't even know how to explain it. I just said, "Mama, can we ask him not to come this week?" She gave me a sharp look over her glasses. "Don't be rude. Kathleen, Mr. Delaney has been through more than you'll ever understand. He's part of this family. Part of the family." It echoed in my head long after she said it. That was the beginning of my silence. Because how do you speak against someone who's been invited into your home, your family, your heart? Looking back now, I know my parents never meant to put me in harm's way. They saw Frank through the eyes of loyalty, through war stories and long winters of shared labor, but they never looked at him through mine. As I grew older, I began to notice the subtle shifts in how Frank treated me. When I was little, he called me Katie Bug. By the time I turned 9, it became pretty girl. He started commenting on my changing body. You're filling out just like your mama did, and I hated the way it made me feel, like I was being studied under a microscope I hadn't agreed to stand beneath. But I didn't fight it. I didn't run. I did what many little girls do in small towns where everyone knows everyone and secrets are swallowed by the fog. I smiled. I pretended. I got very, very good at pretending. The thing about pretending, though, is that it never lasts forever. It happened the summer I turned 10. July in Kennebunkport is heavy with humidity, and the air smells of fish and pine. That particular Sunday, Mama had sent me upstairs early to change out of my church dress. I remember the fabric. It was yellow with tiny blue flowers. I had worn it every Easter since I was 8, and it was getting tight around the arms. The sun was setting in orange streaks through the blinds as I slipped out of it and into my cotton pajamas. I didn't hear him come up the stairs. Frank always let himself in, like he was a second father. I was in my room brushing my hair when the floor creaked behind me. I turned, expecting Mama or Daddy, but it was him. He filled the doorway with that same crooked grin, holding 2 root beers like he used to when we'd sit out back watching fireflies. I thought we could share a treat, he said. I took it, because what else does a child do when an adult offers kindness? But his eyes weren't kind. They swept over me slowly, and I felt the root beer turn sour in my hand. Still, I laughed nervously, brushing a curl behind my ear like I'd seen girls do in the movies. I should go back downstairs, I said, voice thin. Just for a minute, Frank murmured. Then he stepped into my room and shut the door behind him. In the silence that followed, everything changed. He didn't yell. He didn't hit. What he did was quieter, more confusing. His voice stayed gentle as his hands turned rough. He kept talking like nothing was wrong, as if explaining a recipe or the rules to a game. I froze, my body stiff with disbelief. When he finally stood and left, whistling as he went down the stairs, I sat on my bed with the untouched root beer sweating in my hand. I was 10, and just like that, my childhood ended. I didn't cry, not right away. That came later, under the covers, when I pressed a pillow to my face to muffle the sounds. But that night was only the beginning. Frank kept visiting, week after week, and each time he found a new excuse to be alone with me, helping me with homework, looking at a scraped knee, asking for help finding his lost cufflink in the guest room. I became an expert at avoiding slipping out back when I heard his car, hiding in the laundry room, pretending to nap. But sometimes he'd corner me anyway. And always, always. His voice stayed soft, like he was doing me a favor, like I owed him something. I started to believe that maybe I did. That confusion is the cruelest part. Frank didn't act like a monster. He smiled. He brought gifts. He praised me. And when it was over, he acted like nothing had happened at all. So how could I explain the shame that settled like a stone in my chest when I tried to tell my mother again, months later? I couldn't even find the words. I told her I didn't want Frank in the house. She snapped the dish towel and said sharply, "Enough of that foolishness, Kathleen. You don't know what it means to be loyal." Loyal. To who? At school, I was quieter than ever. My teachers asked if I was feeling all right, and I'd nod, smiling like I practiced in the mirror. I didn't have bruises. I didn't have marks. just a growing weight inside me that no one could see. I stopped laughing, stopped drawing. I began chewing my fingernails until they bled. At night, I prayed God, make him stop, make me invisible, make me anywhere but here. But nothing changed, except me. One evening, my father called me Sunshine, the nickname he'd used since I was little. I flinched, not because of him, but because Frank had whispered it into my ear just the day before. That word, my word, now felt filthy. After that, I stopped going near Daddy. I couldn't bear for him to touch me, not even in kindness. I feared he'd see it in my eyes that I was broken, dirty, ruined, and I hated myself for it. Looking back now, I wish I could reach into that bedroom, take my 10-year-old self by the hand, and say, it's not your fault. None of it is your fault. But at the time, no one said that. Not my family, not the neighbors, not the church, and certainly not Frank. Instead, I swallowed it. I buried it. I wrapped it up in silence and wore it like armor, hoping one day I might just forget. But pain like that doesn't go away. It waits. It festers. And eventually, it finds a way out. By the time I turned 12, I had perfected the art of being invisible. I walked through the world like a shadow of myself, always careful, always quiet. At school, I got good grades, not because I wanted praise, but because success made people stop asking questions. At home, I stayed out of sight whenever Frank came over, hiding behind furniture or locking myself in the bathroom until he left. But the house wasn't big enough to disappear in. He always found a way. The visits didn't stop, they became more frequent. By then, I understood what was happening wasn't normal. I still didn't have the language to name it, but my body reacted instinctively: nausea, trembling, night sweats. I started sleeping with a lamp on, flinching at every sound outside my bedroom door. My hair began falling out in clumps. My hands were raw from washing them over and over again, as if I could scrub the shame off. Still, I said nothing, because every time I tried, even in the smallest way, I was met with denial. One afternoon, I dared to say to Mama, Frank makes me feel weird. I don't want to be alone with him. She looked up from her sewing, not with concern, but with irritation. You always were too sensitive. Kathleen, the man's been through war, through loss. Have some compassion. That word again. Compassion. For him, never for me. I wanted to scream, but I swallowed it. My voice stayed locked inside me, even as my world became smaller and smaller. One Sunday evening, it happened in the kitchen. Mama had gone to the neighbors to return a pie tin. Daddy was out back in the shed. I was scraping the remains of dinner into the trash when Frank slipped in, as quiet as a ghost. He didn't even speak. He just came up behind me, pressed his hand over mine on the counter. I froze. The world tilted. My breath caught in my throat. And then for the first time I fought back. I elbowed him, hard. He stumbled, swore under his breath, and glared at me with a flash of something I'd never seen before: anger. Then, like nothing had happened, he smiled again. You're getting feisty, little bird, he said, brushing crumbs from his coat. Careful where that leads you. I remember standing there, heart pounding, shoulders trembling, and thinking, no one is going to save me. That night, I made a plan. It wasn't much, just a decision to never be alone again. I asked my teacher if I could stay after school and help clean erasers or shelve books. I offered to run errands for the elderly widow 2 doors down. I begged Daddy to teach me how to fix tools in the shed, just so I could avoid being inside when Frank came over. Still, I couldn't dodge him every time. He caught me once in the hallway when Mama was upstairs folding laundry. He put a finger to his lips and whispered, "Don't start trouble. You'll break your poor mother's heart." The words were like poison, as if I was the one who'd be to blame if the truth came out. I started writing things down, not full sentences, just words dirty, trapped, fear, please stop. I scribbled them in the margins of my notebooks, hid them under my mattress. I think I was trying to prove to myself that I wasn't making it up, that this was real, that I existed, even if no one saw me. And then one day, I wrote something different, tell someone, but who I was, only 13, a child, and he was my father's best friend, the man who brought pies to church potlucks and tipped his hat at every neighbor. Who would believe me? Still, that word lingered. Tell. It began to bloom into a thought, faint, fragile, but persistent. At school, I watched the new guidance counselor, Ms. Ramirez, as she helped other kids with far simpler problems, trouble with homework, teasing on the playground. But she listened, really listened. She leaned in when people spoke and didn't interrupt. Maybe, just maybe. One Thursday, I stayed behind after class. My legs felt like cement as I walked down the hall. My palms were slick with sweat. I hovered outside her office for 10 full minutes before knocking. She smiled when I stepped in. "Hi, Kathleen. Everything all right?" I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. The silence stretched. Then I whispered, "Can I talk to you about something?" She nodded slowly. "Of course." I sat down across from her, my feet swinging above the floor. And for the first time in 3 years, I began to speak not everything, not yet, just a sentence. "I don't feel safe at home when my father's friend visits." Her expression didn't change. She just asked gently, "What makes you feel that way?" And I answered. It was the first crack in the dam, the first drop of truth to escape. And though it would take time and many more painful steps, it was the beginning of the end. That afternoon with Ms. Ramirez changed the course of my life. I didn't even realize it then how something so small, a single thread pulled from the fabric of silence, could unravel years of pain. But it did. She didn't push me, and she didn't look shocked. That mattered more than I can explain. She simply leaned forward and asked, "Has this happened more than once?" I nodded. She reached across the desk and placed a box of tissues in front of me. I hadn't realized I was crying, but my hands were shaking, my voice brittle as I whispered, "He's my dad's best friend. Nobody believes me, not even my mom." Her expression softened, and she said something I hadn't heard in so long it nearly broke me. "I believe you." Kathleen. I remember staring at her, that one sentence echoing in my chest. I'd waited so many years to hear those words, to know I wasn't crazy, that someone, an adult, finally saw me. She didn't ask for names right away. She didn't demand details. She gave me space and time, and she told me she'd help me talk to someone who could protect me. That scared me, because telling meant risking everything: my family, my safety, my already fragile place in the world. But something had shifted in me. I had spoken the truth once, and now it refused to go back into hiding. The school brought in a counselor, then a social worker. They asked questions gently, guiding me through what I could say. They didn't force anything, but eventually, I named him. Frank Barrow. I watched their faces change the moment I did. Ms. Ramirez closed her eyes for a moment, like she was gathering herself. Then she asked the question I dreaded most. Have you told your parents? I shook my head. My mom told me I was being dramatic, that he's a hero. And your dad, I swallowed. He'd never believe it. He thinks Frank walks on water. They told me that Child Protective Services would have to get involved, that I would be safe, that I didn't have to go through it alone. But the moment I walked through the door of my house that evening, everything inside me started to crumble again. Frank was sitting at our kitchen table. He smiled at me. That same smile, calm, rehearsed, hollow. Hey there. Sunshine. I froze. The food on the table turned my stomach. I barely heard my dad's voice asking me how school was, or Mama humming over the sink. I just stood there, fists clenched, every nerve in my body screaming. I turned and ran, locked myself in the bathroom and sobbed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, 2 people from Child Protective Services came to the school. They spoke with me, and then with my permission with my parents. What followed was a storm I wasn't ready for. Mama's face turned to stone when they told her. She denied it outright. My daughter has always been too sensitive, she said sharply. Frank would never, he's family. Daddy didn't speak at first. He just stared at the floor, unmoving. Later that night, when we were home and the caseworker had left, he came into my room. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. Is it true? He asked. I couldn't look at him. I just nodded. He didn't say anything for the longest time. Then he said quietly, I should have seen it. It was the first time I saw my father cry. The next few weeks were a blur. Frank stopped coming around, but not because he was arrested, because Daddy told him never to come back. I learned later that no charges were filed at the time. Too little evidence, too many years gone, and my word, a scared 13-year-old girl, wasn't enough. But what changed was this. I was no longer alone. Daddy watched me differently after that, protective, hurting, regretful. He apologized not just once, but over and over, quietly, in little gestures, fixing the lock on my door, sitting outside my room until I fell asleep, driving me to school instead of letting Mama. Mama, though. She never truly came around. She refused to talk about it. You've embarrassed this family. She told me once when I asked why she wouldn't speak Frank's name. You've ruined years of friendship over some girlish fantasy. That hurt more than Frank ever did. But I no longer begged her to understand. I'd found something far more powerful than her validation. My voice. I started seeing a counselor every week. Slowly, I began to unravel the layers of guilt and confusion, shame and self-loathing. I started writing again, not just scribbled words hidden under my mattress, but stories, poems, letters I never sent. My words became my lifeline. In 8th grade, I stood in front of our class for a public speaking assignment and read a poem called The Man in the Doorway. I didn't name Frank, but I didn't have to. Every girl in the room knew. Every teacher watched in silence. Afterward, a girl I barely knew came up and hugged me. Me too, she whispered. It was then I understood my pain could become something more than just sorrow. It could become hope. High school was both a battlefield and a rebirth. There were still scars. I couldn't walk into a crowded hallway without checking for exits. I avoided dark corners, loud laughter, and sudden touches. But each day I made it through was another brick laid in the foundation of something I never thought I'd feel again, safety. Daddy never talked about Frank again, but his presence in my life deepened. He taught me how to drive, helped me with my science projects, even sat front row at my school play. He never said the words, "I'm sorry I didn't see it," but I didn't need them anymore. I felt them in every act of quiet tenderness. Mama, though, drifted further. She cooked meals, folded laundry, asked how school was, but there was a chill behind every word. She couldn't meet my eyes, and she never once asked about the caseworker, the therapy, or the story I'd told. I tried, truly tried to forgive her, but forgiveness, I learned, isn't just a choice. It's a process, a slow one. Instead, I turned toward the people who did believe me. Miss Kim Ramirez stayed in my life long after middle school. She wrote me recommendation letters for summer writing camps and sent me books she thought I'd love. It was because of her that I applied to a youth leadership program in Boston, a program that taught girls like me how to use our stories for change. That summer, when I was 16, I stood in a circle with a dozen other young women. Each one carried a story. Each one had endured something no child ever should. And as I listened, truly listened, I realized I wasn't a broken thing wandering through the world. I was a survivor among survivors. We weren't victims. We were a chorus. That experience cracked something wide open in me. I started volunteering at the women's shelter in Kennebunkport on weekends. I'd read to the younger kids, help mothers fill out job forms, or just sit quietly beside them in waiting rooms. And slowly, I began to speak more openly. By my senior year, I gave a speech at our town hall as part of a youth advocacy group. I shared my story, not every detail, but enough for people to recognize the courage it takes to tell the truth. Enough for the hush in the room to turn into applause. And afterward, a woman in her 70s came up to me. She was trembling. I never told anyone, she whispered, until tonight. Thank you. It took my breath away. That moment stayed with me for years. After high school, I left for college in upstate New York, a clean slate. I studied psychology and literature, determined to one day help others the way Ms. Ramirez had helped me. I never forgot the faces of the girls I'd met at the Boston camp or the woman at the town hall. Their voices were always with me. And while Mama never changed, never apologized, and never admitted what she ignored, I slowly learned that healing didn't require her acknowledgement. It required mine. It required reclaiming my worth every single day. By the time I was 30, I opened a nonprofit center in Maine called Brave Light, a haven for girls and women living through trauma. We offered therapy, writing workshops, legal resources, and above all, we listened, truly listened. Now, at 75, looking back on all the decades behind me, I think often of the girl I was, the one frozen in that kitchen, terrified, the one who believed no one would ever come for her, but someone did. And because of that, I learned to come for others. That's the legacy I leave behind. Not silence, but voice. Not fear, but fierce hope. I hadn't set foot back in my childhood home in over 3 decades. Even after opening Brave Light and becoming a well-known advocate for survivors across New England, I never once returned to that White House on the edge of Kennebunkport, where the wallpaper in the hallway still haunted my dreams. But when Daddy passed quietly, in his sleep, holding a photograph of me and my daughter, that house became mine. At 71, I stood on that porch again, the salt air brushing against my face, the creak of the steps still familiar underfoot. The key was cold in my hand, but it slid into the lock easily. The door opened, and I was 12 again. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old memories. The wallpaper was faded, the carpet worn, but everything was in its place, as if time had stood still since the day I ran out crying and didn't look back. I walked through the rooms slowly, Daddy's recliner, the chipped edge of the dining table, Mama's floral curtains still hanging in the kitchen window. I paused in the doorway of the den. The chair where Frank used to sit had been reupholstered years ago, but I saw it clearly, the way he sat back with his legs spread too far. The smirk he'd wear when Daddy wasn't looking. That chair had held decades of trauma I never told anyone about until it nearly drowned me. My daughter, Celia, arrived an hour later. She was 32, bold and kind. She'd grown up knowing pieces of my story, but not all of it. That day, I told her the rest. We sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her fingers resting gently over mine. "Why did you keep this place?" she asked softly. I looked out the window, the ocean just visible beyond the treetops. "Because it's part of the story," I said, "and because healing means not just escaping, but reclaiming." That weekend, we cleared the house. Photos were boxed, papers sorted, dishes wrapped in newspaper. But I left one room untouched, my old bedroom. I stood in there, late one night, after Celia had gone to sleep. I sat on the edge of the twin bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence. And then I opened the journal I'd found in the closet. It was mine, old, worn, filled with childish handwriting. One entry in particular stood out, dated July 12, 1963. He came again. "Mama told me not to lie, but I'm not lying. I want to disappear." I pressed my palm against the page, as if to comfort the girl I had once been. "You made it," I whispered. "You're still here." The next morning, I brought the journal to Brave Light. I placed it in a glass case in our entrance hall, beneath a sign that read, "You are not alone." Visitors stopped to read it, young women, older survivors, volunteers. Some wept, some left notes beside it. One read, "This could have been me. Thank you for surviving. Back in Kennebunkport. I didn't sell the house. I turned it into a retreat, quiet weekends for women who needed peace. We added rocking chairs to the porch, soft linens to the beds, and named it The Haven." Mama had passed long ago. She never came to terms with the truth. But Daddy, he'd left me a letter. I found it tucked inside his Bible. "Kathy, I was too late. I know that. But I never stopped loving you. I hope you find peace here one day. Not for what I failed to see, but for what you had the strength to survive. Love always, Dad." I wept, because forgiveness, like healing, comes not in one moment, but in 1,000 small ones. In the creak of an old step, in the whisper of the tide, in the sound of your own voice saying, "I am still here." I never expected the house that once held my worst memories to become a place of restoration for others. But that's exactly what the Haven became. It started with just a few women survivors who came through Brave Light's doors, unsure if they could ever feel whole again. I invited them to spend a weekend by the sea, to breathe deeply in a place where no one expected anything from them. No demands, no shame, just stillness. And something miraculous happened. They began to open up. We'd sit together on the wraparound porch with mugs of coffee in hand, wrapped in soft blankets as the early morning fog rolled through the pines. We didn't need to rehash the horror stories in detail. We just listened. One woman crocheted by the window and shared how she'd finally slept through the night. Another took long walks down the dirt path to the beach and came back with tears in her eyes and sand on her ankles. I never thought I'd feel safe again. One whispered, but I do hear. I do now. That broke something in me and healed it at the same time. I put all my savings into renovating the second floor to create 3 more bedrooms. Celia helped me write grant proposals, and before long, we had enough funding to keep the retreat open year-round. Women came from all over Maine, then from across New England, some young and newly wounded, others in their 60s and 70s who had carried the burden of silence their entire lives. At night, we held circles by the fireplace. We read poetry. Sometimes we laughed until we cried. Sometimes we only cried. There was no pressure to heal in a straight line. One spring, a woman named Ellen came to stay with us. She was 76, a retired nurse from Rhode Island. Quiet, guarded. She barely spoke the first day. But on her third night, while we sat outside watching the stars, she reached for my hand and said, "My father's friend did to me what yours did to you. I've never told anyone, not in 70 years. But you, I heard your story, and now I don't feel like I'm carrying it alone anymore." I held her hand and didn't let go. It became clear to me that the Haven wasn't just a retreat. It was a revolution in its own quiet way, a place where women like me, who had once lived in fear and shame, could reclaim something precious, their voice, their time, their truth, and more than anything, each other. Over the years, we planted a garden out back, roses, sunflowers, wild lavender. Each visitor added something to it: flowers for those they lost, herbs for hope, vines for the strength it took to climb out of the dark. It flourished, just like we did. I led writing workshops from the old kitchen table. I taught journaling as a way to release pain. Some of those journals would later be published in an anthology called Our Voices, Our Light. We printed 1,000 copies. We sold out in 3 weeks. People wanted to hear us. The little girl in me, the one who used to hide behind curtains when Frank came over. She wept the day we held a public reading at the Kennebunkport Library. Celia stood beside me and introduced me as her mother, her hero, and her greatest teacher. "I grew up in the house where my mother was once hurt," she told the audience. "But I never saw it as a house of pain. I saw it as a house of healing, because that's what she made it. I don't know if there's a word big enough for that kind of redemption, but I do know what it feels like. It feels like peace. It feels like holding another woman's trembling hand and knowing exactly what to say, not because you rehearsed it, but because you lived it. It feels like finally understanding that survival isn't the end of the journey. Survival is only the beginning. By the time I turned 74, the Haven had welcomed over 300 women. Some stayed for just a weekend. Others returned every year, finding solace in the sea breeze and the stories we wove together in the quiet hours before dawn. But what surprised me most was how our work began to ripple far beyond the porch steps of that old house in Kennebunkport. One afternoon, I received a call from a reporter at the Boston Globe. She'd read our anthology and wanted to write a feature about our retreat and the growing movement of elder survivors reclaiming their stories. I hesitated. At first, attention had never been my goal. But then I remembered all the women who had lived and died in silence, whose names were never spoken, whose pain was never acknowledged. We had broken that silence. We had earned the right to be heard. The article went viral. Donations poured in. Survivors from all over the country reached out, some just to say thank you, others asking how to start their own havens in their hometowns. One letter struck me deepest. It came from the granddaughter of a woman who had stayed with us the year before. My grandmother never spoke about her past until she came to you. She died peacefully last week. In her final hours, she said, "Tell them I was never just a victim. I was a warrior, and I found my peace at the Haven." Thank you for giving her that. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I read those words. I never sought to build a legacy. I only wanted to survive. But somehow, by telling the truth and refusing to be silenced, I helped others reclaim their dignity. Together, we created something beautiful out of what was once unbearable. That winter, the town of Kennebunkport held a ceremony honoring local contributions to community wellness. I stood on the steps of Town Hall, holding Celia's hand, as the mayor presented me with a plaque that read, "Kathleen King, for turning pain into purpose and a house into a home." I didn't expect applause. I certainly didn't expect a standing ovation, but I got both. And in the front row, I saw the faces of so many who had walked the long road beside me: Ellen, Margaret, Lena, and even my cousin Ray, who had flown in from Vermont. We had all lived through something we didn't ask for, but now we lived for something greater. That night, back at the Haven, we lit candles in the garden, one for every survivor who had ever stepped through our doors. As the flames flickered against the dark, I felt something settle deep within me. Not just peace, not just healing, legacy, not the kind built on fame or fortune, but on honesty, on connection, on love. I once believed my story was a source of shame. Now, I see it as a bridge. And every woman who walks across it toward healing adds another plank of strength beneath her feet. There's a quiet moment, just before dawn, when the sea outside my window holds its breath. The wind hushes, the waves slow, and the old house, with its creaky floors and warm wooden walls, feels like it's listening too. Sometimes I sit alone in that moment, a cup of tea warming my hands, and I think of her, the little girl I used to be, Kathleen King from Kennebunkport, Maine, just a child with tangled hair and bruised silence, praying that someone, anyone, would notice the fear behind her smile. No one did. Not then. But I see her now. I see her clearly. I speak to her softly. You made it. You survived what tried to destroy you, and you turned it into something that heals others. That truth is no small thing. It took me most of my life to understand this, but maybe it'll help someone reading this right now. Your story, no matter how dark, how painful, how hidden, is not a stain. It is a seed, and when you choose to speak it, to honor it, to plant it in the soil of truth, something beautiful will grow. I was abused by someone my family trusted. I was betrayed by silence. I was left alone with a burden too heavy for a child to carry. And for decades, I thought that was the end of my story, but it wasn't. The real ending began the day I chose to speak, the day I reached for help, the day I stopped asking, "Why me?" and started asking, "What can I do with this pain?" That decision changed everything. It brought me peace. It brought me purpose. It brought me you, the person reading or listening to this now. Maybe you've lived through something no one knows. Maybe you've buried your truth so deep you almost forgot it was there. Or maybe someone made you feel like your pain didn't matter because it happened so long ago. But it does matter. You matter. You are never too old to heal. You are never too late to begin again. You are never too broken to be made whole. Let me say that again for the woman sitting alone in her kitchen, or the man staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., or the grandparent who still flinches at loud voices even after all these years. You are not what was done to you. You are what you choose to become despite it. That is the lesson of my life. And now I pass it to you. If my story touched you, if it made you feel seen or gave you even a flicker of hope, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me your story or just let me know you're out there. You're not alone anymore. And if you believe stories like mine deserve to be heard, especially by those who've been silent for far too long, please subscribe to this channel. Together, we can build a community where truth is honored, healing is possible, and no one ever has to suffer in silence again. From my heart to yours, thank you for listening. Thank you for believing, and thank you for walking this road with me. There is life after pain. There is light after darkness, and there is always, always hope.